Why do I write? I write for several reasons, probably foremost of which is it's the only thing I can do, to be honest. I say that because I have friends who I believe are cursed by being multi-talented. And I do feel like that is a curse. Or if you're not cursed by being multi-talented, I know people who are cursed by having many different interests. So their attention is kind of fragmented across many fields. And I think it's difficult when you're like that, unless you're truly a Renaissance person and you can kind of handle all of it at once. I think it's hard to sort of find your way. And, I just never was interested in anything else. I was never particularly good at anything else. There's never been anything else that I wanted or craved or loved as much as this work. So in that one way, I would say that my life has been phenomenally simple. I've managed to complicate my life in all sorts of other ways. But just this was a kind of, I don't know, I think in everybody's life, there's one thing that you get handed as a simple gift. And for me, it was this whole idea of writing. I follow my curiosity. I suppose that's where most people's creative processes begin, unless they're sort of more analytical and intellectual about it, and they actually set out to conquer or understand something, which isn't necessarily how I work. I always feel like it's a tap on the shoulder that begins it, and it's not necessarily a passionate response at the beginning. Curiosity is the best word for it, because you feel this little tap, and then it just pulls your attention for a minute, and you just think, well, that's funny. Why did I get that response? Why am I interested in lobster fishermen? Why does that tweak something in me? And then you sort of sniff it out. And for me, I'm not a particularly imaginative person. I have a sister, Catherine Murdoch, who's also a writer, and she's really a fabulist. Even when we were growing up, she was kind of like Scheherazade. She can just invent things and make up worlds, and I've never been that kind of person. My interest is much more about reflecting on the world as it is. Even when I was writing fiction, I felt like I had to kind of go to the places that I was writing about and roll around in them for a while, and just really commune with the people there and like taste the soil, and learn about it. And so my creative process is really involving. It's really about a kind of all over sensory experience, and I can't begin to write something until I feel like I've become a bit of an expert on it. So the writing comes last, and it's all this build-up, all this research, all this thinking, all this contemplation, all this experimentation. And then once I've got this collective of ideas and information and notes, I can sit down, and at that point, it starts to feel like I'm an archaeologist, and that underneath all of those notes there's an ancient city, and I just have to kind of dust it and find it and piece it together and put the pieces of pottery and shards and kind of recreate it in some strange and kind of indescribable way. Well, I'm a big conversationalist, so I listen, I'm always on guard. Yeah, I had a friend who used to say that Liz gets her magazine stories by going to a bar and talking to somebody, and just hearing something that sticks out, as interesting. So there's a lot of talking involved in my work, and I don't think that's necessarily all that common for writers. I think a lot of people become writers specifically because they can't abide that, and they don't want to be in the mix and in the conversation, and they would prefer to be having a sort of hidden dialogue in silence. I'm not like that. So definitely I feel like I have to be engaged wherever I am with the people who are around me, that really helps a lot. And then, I'm just very, it's weird because in the rest of my life I'm not this way, but when it comes to writing I'm very disciplined. I grew up on a farm, and I was the most useless person on that farm. But somehow I kind of took all those lessons about doing your chores and being responsible, and I applied them to this work. And so I was really bad at taking care of the chickens in the garden, but somehow it's the same muscles or something that I use. And when I'm working, I'm pretty diligent about kind of clearing out my life and setting aside huge periods of time, going to bed early, getting up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, working in this very rigorous kind of hour by hour disciplined way. And I can't focus or cope without that. So I can't write in chaos. So there's a certain amount of order that I have to keep in my life in order to be able to work. It's funny, actually, my meditation practice completely, what there is of it, completely drops away when I'm working. I think it's because the work is a meditation itself, and also because there is absolutely no way I would be able to quiet my mind when I'm in the process of creating, and I wouldn't want to. I kind of need to keep it, like keep those ovens kind of fired up. I don't really want them to come down to a certain level of calmness. Um, Although it is calming, oddly, because it's so, uh, I don't know, such an enormous sense of focus, which is actually, of course, what meditation is. So instead of sitting in silence and staring at a candle, I'm sort of sitting in silence and staring at a page full of words and just trying to kind of drive my attention to solving whatever the problem is. And physically, that all falls away when I'm working too. I just, everything kind of falls away when I'm working, and which is part of the reason that I've found over the years that when it comes time to actually write a book, it's really kind of better if I go away. And as much as the beginning of my creative process is so much about being around people and ideas and conversation, once I'm actually working, I really sort of need to be in a cave by myself, not showering, and not talking to anybody, and not going to yoga class, and any sort of engagement becomes a really big distraction at that point. I think the physical surroundings affect enormously where you are and what you're writing about. I mean, for so much of my life, I actually went and kind of manipulated myself into particular physical surroundings. And certainly the book Eat, Pray, Love is all about what these three countries, Italy, India, and Indonesia, bring forth from me, and that's why the three sections of the book are so different, because they were composed in these different places. But I don't know. I'm changing about that now, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure anymore. I've really, my life has quieted down a lot, and now I live in New Jersey, so God knows what that's going to bring. But it's, I don't know. Now I'm feeling a different impulse, which is about community and being in this small town and having certain daily rituals and having a garden and neighbors and pets, and all that stuff kind of matters to me in a really serious way now, which makes me think that my work is probably going to change as a result, or maybe this is the beginning of a new topic of discussion in my mind. Well, I mean, I think if spiritual enlightenment was only open to the rich would be hopefully a lot better people than they are. So I don't think they're necessarily linked. But I think, I have people ask me a lot of the time questions along the lines of, how can I possibly, I can't afford to do what you did. I can't afford to go and take a year off from my work, from my family, from my obligations, from the contracts, the social contracts that I have with people, or the illness that I'm taking care of, or whatever the things are that hold people into the places where they're staying. And they say I can't afford to do that in any way, in any definition of the word afford. So how can I have the experiences that you had? And I think it would be insulting for me to walk around telling people that they could do that. Because the reality is that even in my life, which has been a life that's I've got a lot of freedom. I don't have children. I've been lucky enough to have a career that facilitates travel. I'm healthy. Even in my life, there was only one moment when I could have done that, and it was that year. I couldn't do it now. I'm way too entrenched in the lives of people around me to do it again. And I have one of the freest schedules of anybody on earth. So and I also don't think everybody should do that. I have a friend, one of my favorite moments before I left on this trip, this editor friend of mine in New York said to me, wow, you're going to an ashram for 4 months to meditate. There's a part of me that so wishes that I wanted to do that, but I really, really have no desire for it whatsoever. He's got to find his way in a different path. But I do think there are people who long for that. And all I can think of is that, if the only people who had spiritual enlightenment available to them are those who could afford a plane ticket to India, the world would be an even more unfair place than it already is. And the example that I always think of is this friend of mine from high school. Actually, he was my prom date, who's in prison now, as my mom predicted at the time. But anyway, he's having the spiritual experience of a lifetime because he's using that time to to focus on meditation and contemplation and self-transformation. And he's in an 8 by 8 foot room where every minute of his day is sort of organized by other people. I would argue that it's probably easier to find time to meditate in prison than it is if you have 2 little kids at home, and you're also sort of holding down a job and struggling with a lot of other issues. But I have to believe, because it would warp too much my understanding of humanity, that questions of divinity are available to anybody, and that the entrance to those questions are everywhere. And certainly evidence shows that. People have transcendent religious experiences in refugee camps. They have them in traffic jams. They have them during war. They have them at their offices. These invitations arrive in people's lives wherever they are. And I was lucky enough, for a lot of reasons, to be able to carve out this huge period of time to go to this very special place and do this work in a really organized way. But my spiritual practices today, in my life in New Jersey, are nothing compared to a lot of people I know who have much busier lives than me, who insist on making time for this. They wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they hold that time sacred, and they work at it and they meditate, and they didn't have any of the advantages that I have, and they are way, way, way closer to the destination that I was seeking, merely on account of the fact that they're demanding it, whether they live in Queens or, Indiana. So I don't know. I don't know why Eat, Pray, Love has had the impact that it's had. I also don't know. I mean, I've written books before this, and they sold upwards of dozens of copies each. I don't know how that happened. If I knew how that happened, I would do it again, or I would have been doing it all along. There's a certain randomness in the way that my questions, for some reason, about my life intersected, dovetailed with questions that apparently a lot of other people, women in particular, at this moment in history were asking about their lives. One possible answer is, I do feel like I'm a pretty representative example of my culture. I'm pretty representative 21st century middle-aged American woman in the way that I've been educated, in the way that, in the things that I've been led to believe that my life should feel like, in the disappointments that I experience when my life doesn't feel like that, the particular kinds of questions that haunt me, the things that I want and wonder about. I don't think I have any particularly special, I think I feel that stuff the same way that certainly everybody I know feels those things. And again, pointing to the question of privilege, because of the fact that I'm a writer, I have, and because of the fact that I've been able to build a career as a writer and sort of organize my time in a certain way, I have access to a lot more time than other people might have to think about those things. I was able to say, I'm going to take one entire year and do literally nothing every minute of the day except think about all these questions. I remember before I left on the trip, this friend of mine who's a mother of 2, she has a doctorate, she's at home right now with her kids, but certainly has this ferociously intelligent mind. She just sat me down and said, take us with you. All of us who are asking these same things but are staying here, with our families, with our kids, with our work, take us with you and ask the questions that we would ask and do the work that we would want to do if we could. So I think I felt a great obligation to do that while I was traveling in a way I didn't forget that, and I would ask myself, what would Cree, Susan, Kat want to know if they were here, and sort of fill that in and then try to answer those questions on the page. And I wrote the book very directly as a letter to one specific person. I wrote the book to my friend Darcy Stanky, who's a wonderful novelist and a memoirist, and who's also on a very different sort of spiritual path, but a different one from me. She's a student of Christianity, but is also this hipster who lives in Brooklyn, single mom. And we've had a long-ranging conversation over the years about marriage, about divinity, about autonomy, about all these questions that, are foremost in our minds. And this book became a kind of extended letter to her. And the one thing that I've heard people to say when they read the book or when they respond to it in this way, and certainly not everybody has responded to it positively, by the way, but the people who do say, I feel as though we were having a conversation. And I feel as though you were talking directly to me. Because in a sense I was talking directly to one person who is also a very representative 21st century American woman. And so maybe that's it, maybe it just feels like, we're knee to knee with like a cup of coffee between us trying to figure out this stuff together, which maybe we need right now. Yeah, well, I think that going and traveling very literally to very literal places is about as much the opposite of like the Facebook blogosphere virtual, avatarish world that so many people live in, or at least that I hear so many people live in. I'm not sure whether people live in that world quite as much as commentators like to imagine that they do. I still feel like people have a lot of interpersonal contact and communication with each other in really real ways. Although there's nothing like actually going to Naples and eating a pizza, to make you feel like you're really in a place doing a thing. But I don't think that, I'm not sure that the dream of pilgrimage is new, I think it's hardwired into us in some way, the yearning to step aside from the fold and the clan and go off into the desert, the mountain, the cave, the holy city, whatever the sort of dream of distance is. That's something that is part of every single human society on Earth. And I think the way I did it was just a way that was reflective of the kind of person that I am and the kind of culture that I grew up in and the kind of stuff that I was yearning for and wanting. But I always found it really interesting. You go back and you read these accounts in Roman histories of people going to India, being sent to India by Indian emperors, or sorry, by Roman emperors, people being sent to India to specifically find these yogis that everybody was talking about and see if they could get an audience with them and see if they could study them. And then they would come back to Rome and they would report, there are these guys who, go into these states where their hearts stop beating and claim to, understand the makings of the world. And people were sort of discussing that then and longing for that then. So I just think the idea of going on a holy journey is something that not all of us, but damn, a whole lot of us dream about, at some point. I just can't tell you how many people have sort of confessed that to me as though it's some dirty hidden secret, when in fact I think it's almost like a linkage of longing. Well, I'm not really insulted when people call it a self-help book, because I don't know what else you would call a book about somebody helping themselves. Although I guess a self-help book by definition is a book that sort of teaches, like intends, its intention is to set out to sort of create a path and say these are the steps that you have to take. And certainly I wouldn't do that because I don't know what those steps are. But I definitely, use the book as a way to sort of salvage and rescue and recreate my own life, by hand. It was kind of like a Girl Scout project, like there were materials, like with these materials in your own house, you too can build like that's kind of the feeling that I wanted it to have, of a certain kind of self-resourcefulness. But, I say that also with a grain of salt, because I think it's important. We kind of demean the therapeutic abundance that's going on in America right now, and I think we have to do that very carefully, because some of that stuff is really important and some of that stuff really works. And if you go to cultures where people don't have access to those sorts of outlets, you can see how they might be served by them. And as much as we kind of criticize the Oprah-ness of modern life, there's something to be argued for it as well. There's a lot more communication today in a really open way between men and women, within groups of men and women, about what they're feeling, and what they're sad about, and that hasn't always been the case, and it's not the case in every culture on Earth. And when you go see cultures where people are still really buttoned down, you can see where there's a lot of pain that's intrinsic in that. And I myself, as much as I like to call it a sort of self-help book, I didn't set out on that journey until after I had been through 2 years of therapy on the Upper West Side, and 6 months to a year, I can't remember now, but a period of time of antidepressants that I was really ambivalent about, but still consider a bridge, a sort of necessary bridge to get me through the last awful months of my divorce. I probably could have done it without it, but it made it a lot less anguishing for me. So, but that too was, I guess, even so, seeking out help from a professional. I took whatever was available, religion, psychotherapy, friendship, companionship, exercise, drinking 8 glasses of water a day. Look, whatever was on hand, I was using because I was in a lot of trouble. And the last step of it was going off on this journey. But if I certainly wouldn't have been physically or mentally able to do that even a year before, because I was in such a bad place. So I would caution people against sort of leaping off a cliff in some sort of grandiose gesture of self-reclamation if they're not, actually somewhat mentally or psychologically stable enough to handle it. There is a danger, I think. Look, we're a young country, and the more you travel out of America, the more you see that, right? There's so much that's great about youth. There's so much that's great about the youngness of America. There's a certain energy here. There's a certain willingness to try stuff. There's a certain ambition, an eagerness and excitement. I mean, I had friends during the Obama campaign who called me from Europe and said, I cannot even imagine what it would feel like to actually believe in things like hope, to believe in to believe that a politician can change things, to actually have, they were envious, of this huge enthusiasm that was sweeping across America that was really real, and really passionate and really fresh in a way, that doesn't exist everywhere, the downside of that youth and that enthusiasm and that freshness is a certain shallowness, a certain inability to stick to, one path, a certain longing to drink out of every well. Certainly the New Age movement has a lot of that in there, where you're kind of like cherry picking. Like, I want a dream catcher, and I want a crystal, and I want something tantric, and I want the chakras, and I also want to go to mass, and I'm not necessarily against that, because I think there's, I think certainly the willingness to experiment. There's something very beautiful about that, and there's something wonderful about a culture that permits you to do that. That doesn't say there is one church, there is one belief, there is one dogma, and everybody must march in lockstep. But it does get a little goofy. I've been guilty of it myself, so I have to say it with a measure of compassion and affection, because I could easily have been accused of every single piece of flakiness that I sometimes judge, when I see that out there. But it's part of who we are, and consumerism and a profit margin is also part of who we are. So you get things in America like competitive yoga, which I still can never hear without laughing. The idea of going to a yoga competition does seem like maybe the point is being somewhat missed, but I don't know, I don't know what experiences the people in the yoga competition are having. I don't know what their, I don't know enough about what their internal world is. It could be just a big breakthrough for them, winning first place in the meditation prize. I don't know, but it's, I don't know. To me, I still feel like the benefits of that kind of freedom, the benefits of the excitement that people in this country are willing to feel about things, outweigh the goofiness that it's sometimes a little too easy to be snide about. Well, look, something happened to me, but even saying that kind of puts it in a little bit too passive of a voice. I set out looking for something very specific, and through a pretty rigorous search, and a pretty rigorous set of practices, I got that thing that I wanted, which, to put it really simply and perhaps oversimply, is a certain calmness, life is an extremely agitating event, and I vibrate at a slightly higher frequency than is necessarily healthy, and I've always been kind of anxious. I've always been super emotive. I feel things harder than is good for me. Indecision has been part of my life, and I could see after a certain age how that was destructive not only to myself but to people around me. And I just think you get to a point where you don't want to be in other people's way. You don't want to be taking up. You don't want to be taking up other people's space and energies to sort of take care of you. And I longed to be a different kind of person. I longed to be just a little more at ease, a little more relaxed, and a little more wise, because it seems to me that wisdom is the beginning of serenity, and aside from people who are very heavily medicated, the calmest people that I know tend to also be the wisest, who are quickest, or most instinctively able to put things in a perspective that takes away the urgency of the moment. And there are practices that you can do to get there, and those practices, as my friend Richard from Texas always says, the shit works, those practices work. And people do it in different ways, and they do it in different places. But I think that the end result and the end desire is always the same. You want peace, if not in the world, then at least within your own mind. This is not to say that I glide through the world now on a sort of cushion of serenity at all times, because I am, exactly as capable of anybody else at experiencing road rage and sidewalk rage and customer service representative putting you on hold rage and all the other sorts of rages and jealousies and frustrations and self-pity. I mean, all these things are not foreign to me, but I don't know, it's like there's an engine that works within me now that much, much, much more efficiently processes all of that. And I believe and know that that's a direct result of the work that I did for a whole bunch of years, trying to get to that place. And when I find myself kind of spinning out of orbit, there's like a tether, that I braided, myself, from my own beliefs and my own studies and this work, and that tether sort of pulls me back and reminds me, do you really want to go? You really want to make a big production out of this? Or would it be better for you and everybody around you if you just found a way to accept what's going on? And that's just made life very much more pleasant. And I feel like if I can define my spiritual practice today, it is the maintenance of that. It is doing whatever is necessary to keep that healthy, and to keep that system working. And you have to be a little bit nimble and a little bit flexible to kind of figure out what each day requires, in order to keep that going. I find, to be perfectly honest, a lot of it has to do with napping. I just think, I'm alarmed by by reports of how little sleep Americans are getting anymore. Even in the last 10 years, people are getting on average, an hour to 2 hours less sleep a day. It's making people really frazzled and really fragile. And I kind of feel like, if there's a new religion that needs to be founded, it's a religion about like naps. Something happens when you take a nap. You go into another state. Your pulse goes down. Your blood pressure goes down. It's a kind of meditation. It's a kind of loose meditation, and I do a lot of it. It seems to help. It seems to make me more pleasant to the people around me. I would prescribe it to anybody. I think every nation that has any civility incorporates napping into their day in a kind of official way. So, rest. I say no to a lot of things. That's become a kind of active spiritual practice for me. I turn down a lot of things, not just professional invitations, but personal invitations and social invitations. I think saying no is something we're really bad at in this culture. I spent years not saying no to anything because I was afraid that if I said no to people, they wouldn't like me as much and they would be disappointed. And I've learned in my old age that when you say no to people, they don't like you as much and they're disappointed. Nonetheless, there are times when it has to be done in order to protect whatever small sanctity of serenity you have built up in your life. It's inhumane, the pace at which people live in this society. And when I came back from traveling from Eat, Pray, Love, I was truly sort of jaw-droppingly shocked to see it anew from fresh eyes and to see the amount of stress and the amount of work that we have somehow decided is normal. And it is so warped. And my, fear is that we've exported that, and we're sort of exporting that idea all over the world all the time and sort of spreading it like a virus. And it's just, there is absolutely no way you can defend it as healthy, normal, safe, or wise. And yet it's really hard to resist. And you have to push really hard against it, and I don't always succeed. I find myself at the end of my rope all the time. I'm like, how did I end up with a 14-hour day today? Like, why, how did I let that happen? And so there's a sort of vigilance against that I would really strongly argue is part of like the main spiritual practice of my life right now. It's funny because I wrote for and about men for like a solid decade. That's pretty much all I did. I think I had to work through some issues. And also fearful always of my own vulnerabilities. I think I was intrinsically attracted to like flinty, macho people, wanting to be like that because it's not at all how I am. I kind of magnetized toward people like that. And I was interested in them. And, I wrote for Spin for years and I wrote for GQ for years. They're both really male-focused magazines. And, I wrote a book called The Last American Man that was this big study of a woodsman. And then my novel Stern Men was about a girl, but it was a girl in a very manly world who behaved in a very manly manner and who was herself sort of tough and macho and flinty. And then after really a solid decade of doing nothing but kind of exhaustively examining masculinity from every possible angle, to the point that I even did a story for GQ once where I became a man for a week, like really like inhabiting it in this really intense and direct way. My life fell apart, and I wrote my way through it with Eat, Pray, Love, and then the book became this big phenomenon, and suddenly I started hearing myself referred to as a chick lit author, which was really strange after a decade of like really putting in the hours to write about men and think about men. And back in my 20s, people used to say that I wrote like a man, which I took as a compliment, and now I'm often referred to as a chick lit writer, which I'm not even completely certain I know what that means, except that I'm pretty certain it is never intended as a compliment, and I think it's strange. I think it's curious, this whole idea of like gender-based writing. And I have to say the whole chick lit thing bugs me because, in our culture at this moment in time, it is women who read, and pretty much exclusively it is women who read. And there's this kind of denigration of women's reading, which is a pity because they're the ones holding that whole custom up right now. So it's odd. And my next book, which is a memoir and a kind of meditation on the subject of marriage, is definitely sort of, I definitely had female readers in mind when I was writing it. So I don't think the chick lit label's going to go away anytime soon. But I don't know if there's such a thing as gender neutral writing, gender neutral thinking, or I don't know. I'm really interested in questions that most of my female friends are really interested in right now. That's kind of where I'm at the moment. I might go back to writing about cowboys at some point in the future, but I don't really think so. I'm not sure what the next thing will be, but this is where I am now. Yeah, women have special work to do at this point in time. It's a really interesting moment in history to have decided to be a woman. It's, we have, I feel like any woman of our generation, and by our generation, I mean anybody who was born in the last 100 years, basically. I think this era of women have become sort of hamsters in a great unprecedented social experiment, which is what happens if you give women a little bit of power, what happens if you give them autonomy, what happens if you give them control over their reproduction, what happens if you give them earnings, what happens if you give them options. That social experiment has never been played out before. And so we're kind of, I really do feel like we're all sort of hamsters in this maze. It's this big sociological test that's going on, and all of us are sort of figuring out how to do it as we go, because we don't have centuries and millennia of role models for how you do this. We don't have centuries of epics that are written about how you do this. We don't have Odysseus. We have, you know, Penelope, the big weaving and unweaving and weaving and unweaving scene that just gets repeated and repeated and repeated, that doesn't really, it's not really relevant anymore to most of our lives. And so we're all kind of charting our own mythologies as we go. And one of these great things that I heard once about this was Martha Beck said that she feels like she's met only 4 kinds of women in her life recently. And it's women who, the first kind is women who decided to have a family instead of having a career and who feel conflicted about that choice. And then there are women who decided to have a career instead of having a family and who feel conflicted about that choice. And then there are the women who decided to have a family and a career who feel really, really conflicted about that choice. And then there are the mystics. And that's the 4th sort of strange category. And she defines the mystics as a woman from any one of those other 3 categories who has somehow been able to kind of drown out or like drum out all the other distractions and all the other options, and she's chosen her life, being guided by some sort of deeply honest interior voice, and she has made all sorts of peace with what she's doing, and that is who she is, and she is certain of it. And I would argue that any era that demands that people have to essentially become mystics in order to find peace and happiness is a really tough time in which to live, because in other eras and other societies, you didn't necessarily have to be a mystic in order to be a content person. A path was laid out for you that said, this is what a good woman is, and you went and you did those things and you did them well, and you could rest at night, with a certain amount of peace, knowing that you were a good woman. We don't have that consensus anymore about what constitutes a good woman, what constitutes a woman's life well led. I think men, to a certain extent these days, are also struggling with these questions, but not nearly to the extent that women are. I mean, I remember being 18 years old in college and sitting up for hours and hours and weeks on end with my fellow 18-year-olds and trying to figure out what we were going to do in terms of when we were going to have kids and who was going to raise them and how are we going to have careers and what if we went to graduate school and what if we wanted to do, and I got to say, our 18-year-old male peers, I don't think they were over in the dorm room like next door having that conversation. I think they maybe joined that conversation after their first kid was born when they were 36, but I'm not sure they were worrying about that the whole time. So it's hard, and I'm not the first person to have said that, but I think maybe again going back to why Eat, Pray, Love sort of struck a nerve with people, it's like I kind of inserted my own version of how to figure out that into people's conversations, but it's a conversation that's been going on for a really long time that is not nearly over. Oh, it's so easy to find a balance between yourself and your partner. No, I'm kidding. It's not. It's not at all. Eat, Pray, Love ends on a very romantic note because it ends within the first 2 months of a very romantic relationship, right? And so for me, now I'm 5 years into that relationship, so it's always sort of funny to me when people come up and they still have they've just finished the book and they still have this very starry-eyed idea, like, oh, lovely, you found this very romantic relationship. That very romantic relationship has now evolved into a marriage, which, like everybody else's marriage, is complex, and it's much richer than the romantic relationship in the first 2 months was. But I should assure people that that we've actually evolved into an actual real partnership now, and I think that some people were really delighted by the ending of that book because it gave them hope for romance, which we all hold dear in our hearts. I think some people were agitated by the end of that book because they felt like it sent a message that, and therefore the ending is that you have to find a guy and you have to, you have to be loved in this certain way. And, the story was told in the way that it was told simply because that's what happened. What happened was that I did happen to meet somebody who was really lovely, and I wanted to pursue that. I think, I somebody said, well, do you think the message is that you need, that you need love? And I was like, well, I think the message is that you need healthy love, and if you can find that, or something that's as close to that as you possibly can, that's, by all means, that's something that you should feel entitled to look for, A lot of these questions I've been thinking about a lot and working on a lot, because my next book is all about marriage, which is, of course, marriage is kind of the antithesis to romance in a way. And I ended up having to get married because the Homeland Security Department got involved and actually chucked my sweetheart out of the country, and the only way I could get him back was to marry him. And I have, for reasons I probably don't have to go into, really ambivalent feelings about the whole institution of marriage. And so, again, because I have a lot of time on my hands, because I'm a writer, I could spend, 2 years doing nothing but reading books about the history of marriage and sort of trying to wrap my mind around ideas about marriage. And I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on it, but I would say that it becomes clearer to me the more I read about it why it is so very, very confusing for people to try to figure out the balance in their lives between self and other. And again, this isn't a particularly easy time to be trying to figure that out, because those roles have opened up, and men and women can be all sorts of different things in each other's lives than they could be in more traditional and rigorous societies. The stakes are huge because our expectations for happiness are huge, but the opportunities are also really vast because we have a lot of options in organizing our lives by our own terms. So again, welcome to modern life. And I also just think, I don't know, there comes a certain point in your life. I mean, one thing that's been really interesting to me about doing all this research about marriage is just realizing how the expectations that we have burdened this institution with at this point in history are staggeringly huge. Every generation since the 1700s in Western culture has just heaped another layer of expectation on what they want out of this relationship called marriage. And it is so out of scale right now. And there was some survey that back in the 1920s, there was a survey that asked college women what they wanted in a partner, and they listed all these virtues, reliability, honesty, decency, morality, and somewhere down around 6 or 7 on the list came love and passion. These things showed up sort of low on the list. Prudence was sort of up high, and then in the 1970s they asked those questions again to women, and the very first thing on the list is like love, love and connection and intimacy, and then the other stuff they weren't really paying very much attention to. And now it's even worse because they ask college women this question, and they say they want a man who will inspire them every day. Like, I think that's a lot to ask. Or to be asked, to want to expect that the person in your life should sort of almost in this divine way every single day inspire you is a huge thing to want somebody to be. And it's a huge thing to have somebody want from you. I'm only capable of inspiring people like every third Wednesday. Like the rest of the time I'm just trying to find my, keys. I mean, it's hard. And so, while I would never sit down with a young woman and say to her, lower your expectations as a piece of advice for life, I think it's been really sanity inducing in me just after doing all this research about marriage to realize that for better or worse, my expectations are really big, and do with that what you wish, but that's a good piece of information to know, because we shouldn't walk around thinking that this is how people have always thought about marriage, or that this is what people have always expected out of their marriages. And, I'm not quite sure how you resolve that, but it's just a piece of information I didn't have before, and I have it now. And it somehow changes things when inevitable disappointments or frustrations arise. I just think, what would a 17th century wife think about this? What did my great grandmother think about this? It's helpful. Well, I mean, I think like a lot of women when I was younger, um, I don't think I was so much concerned with being objectified. I think I was kind of wishing I would be a little bit more objectified. I'd always been the smart girl, and the bookish girl, and there was a certain sort of sexual attention that I was longing for, and that I was wishing that I could generate, and that I was always really happy to get, and always really happy to pursue, whether or not it benefited me to be out chasing that in a certain way. Well, I was going to say it's up for debate, but it's not. It actually it actually was not beneficial to be giving so much attention to that. I was a boy crazy kid, and I wanted a lot. I'm a very excitable person, and I'm a very passionate person, and just in the same way that as a writer I wanted to kind of go and roll around in the world and experience it in really huge ways. I mean, I had a big, hungry heart that wanted to know love and infatuation and to disappear into the other. And, I mean, everything that you could do to try to do that, I did, and the results were fairly predictable. It's like a lot of messes, a lot of just really messy experimentation with intimacy, a lot of like impaling myself on people in really unhealthy ways, a lot of carelessness and toward people in other really unhealthy ways. It was just a big flat hot mess, but I guess I had to go through that, as many of us do, and kind of see that all out to its natural conclusion, and then take a lot of time to be alone. It's interesting because therapists always say that they have two kinds of patients: the ones that need to be like screwed in a little tighter, and the ones that need to be loosened up. And I was definitely one who needed to be screwed in a little tighter. I know that that other people's psychological problems are that they're too withholding, and mine was kind of the opposite. I had to sort of narrow my margins in order to become sane, and a lot of that for me came just from spending a lot of time by myself, which I had never done before, because I was always seeking that reflection in the other person, and I have a pretty good relationship now, and I sleep with one eye open when it comes to love, because I've made such huge mistakes and I've been so punished for those mistakes. So I think when you've been through a divorce as crappy as my divorce, and when you've been through breakups as bad as my breakup, you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop a little bit. Like, when is this? Is this really gonna? Is this really? 'Cause this is pretty good, but how long is this gonna last? But I also, I don't know, I try not to walk around calling trouble's name. If things are going well, I try to be happy to just let that be well, and recognize that if trouble wants to find you, it knows where you live and it will come and knock on your door. But I don't go looking for it very much anymore. The best advice I've ever gotten came from my mom, and interestingly enough, I don't think she ever gave it to me directly. I just remember hearing it from her in another context. My mom in the 1970s worked as a nurse at Planned Parenthood, and she was really on the front lines of the whole women's reproduction kind of debate, the beginnings of access to birth control, and the beginnings of the idea that people should be taught about their bodies. And it was a really controversial and heated moment in time, and she was right there in the middle of it, and it meant a lot to her. It meant a lot to her for a lot of reasons, but probably foremost of which was that she had grown up in this farming community in Minnesota, where she had watched as every year one 16-year-old after another got pregnant, and it was a scandal, and every single time it was a scandal, as though it had never happened before, much less 6 times in the last year. And every single time the girl's life was ruined unless the boy married her, and the boy's virtue was never questioned. And there was just all sorts of wrongness about it. And she watched her aunts and her mother having more children than they could manage, and there was just a lot about it that was really important to her. And she told me once that, she used to counsel girls and women who were coming to Planned Parenthood with really big decisions to make. And she said to me once that it was so daunting because, they wanted advice, and it was their lives and it was their bodies. And she said that she would tell them, please do me this great service, and please do me this great favor, and please do yourself this great favor, and try to remember 10 years from now, when you're second guessing this decision that you made the very best decision that you could make on this day with the information that you had today. As the years go by, you'll have more information, and you might wish that you had done things differently, but just don't forget that on the day that you had to make the choice, you didn't know, and you only knew what you have now. Don't abuse yourself later for what you didn't know now. And it just strikes me as so compassionate, and it's such an easy thing to forget because if you're like me, you spend a lot of your life in sort of retrospective regret for things that you wish you had known at the time. We can be cruel to ourselves in that way, and it's a lot of wisdom to expect that 10 years ago we should have known what we know now. It's an unreasonable thing to ask. So that would be the best advice I ever got. Just remember when you're in the course of a difficult decision, or when you look back on that difficult decision in decades to follow, that you made the best choice you could given what you had.